Okay, welcome everyone to the Winterville Tree Commission webinar. We are recording this so we can place this webinar on our website. And as Seth had mentioned earlier, which wasn't on this recording, with Winterville Tree Commission, the Commission has engaged in a lot of educational activities through the years, and this year with COVID in 2020, we have had less opportunities to safely have educational events with the public. And so we wanted to offer an educational webinar and have another way that people of Winterville can still learn about trees in the absence of us getting together in person. And so our webinar today is called Planting with a Purpose, Right Tree, Right Place, Right Objectives. And my name's Holly Campbell, and I am the chair of our Winterville Tree Commission, but I'm also part of the Community Forestry and Arboriculture degree program at the UGA Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And my co-presenter today, and these are his lovely slides, is Seth Hawkins, and I'll let Seth introduce himself. Seth, you may be muted.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't get to my unmute. Hey everyone, Seth Hawkins, Georgia Forestry Commission, community forester for the Northeast Georgia area. Thanks for having me. I always love to show my support for the Winterville Tree Commission. I work with communities all over the Northeast part of the state and throughout the state for that matter. And, Winterville has definitely gone above and beyond what a community their size typically does to manage trees and to advocate for trees. Examples, tonight's a great example of going above and beyond. Winterville is a tree city. That's kind of how we started getting together with the Forestry Commission, only for a few years, but you already are going much further beyond that tree city application, doing educational programs like this. And, if you ever just take a walk or a ride through Winterville, I think you see people do care about their trees there. And that's, with a limited, city staff and everything, the onus falls on the community members a lot more to manage their trees. So that's why we wanted to try to bring some of this education to y'all tonight. So.
Okay, so I'm going to get started, and then Seth is going to pick up about halfway through the webinar and pick up where I leave off. But first, I'm going to be talking about site selection and species selection of the tree that one would select. And we're focusing primarily on yard trees. So this is a webinar for the homeowner of Winterville. And some of you may recognize some of the people in this image here. I guess it was Seth, was it 2018 or 2019 where we planted trees at the elementary school?
It was January 2019.
Yes, and we planted several dozen trees at Winterville Elementary. And so this is an image of us on a very frosty morning planting several of these trees. And there's a lot that can be learned in planting a tree right. And so that's a lot of what we want to talk to you about today. And there's a few factors involved in that. So if you could advance the slide, Seth. So there are a few reasons why we often plant trees. And many times people are drawn to the beauty of trees. So they beautify our communities and our homes. They have a lot of wonderful properties like flowers and fruits, nuts even, fall leaf color that really provide a lot of attractiveness to the landscape and can really highlight the home or the community. They also provide some architecture to the landscape, so there's a design element there. Planting trees really feels good. We feel like we're doing something quote unquote good for the environment. And it's something that people have done for a long time. We like planting trees. Can you advance the slide? Thanks. So we have the reasons why we usually plant trees, but why should we plant trees? And these are sort of two different things. And I think that some of this is incorporated in the reasons why we usually plant trees, but there's a lot of reasons why maybe we should plant even more trees. So when canopy is lost, planting trees helps replace that canopy, which seems like a no-brainer. And lost canopy, as far as ecosystem services of trees, I'm going to talk about in a second, canopy cover provides a lot of benefits to a home or a community. And so we plant trees to try to recover that canopy that's lost, because in speaking of the ecosystem services, trees provide a lot of benefits. We're going to speak just to the environmental benefits. So trees help reduce pollution. They help reduce ambient air temperatures. They help take up a lot of the stormwater that runs through our communities and around our homes. They help filter that water. They help prevent erosion of soil. They help reduce noise that could be associated with a variety of factors around our home. And we have here on the slide that trees also help mitigate impervious surface issues, and that's sort of that stormwater runoff. So trees help slow the impact of rain. And so they sort of, the water's still going to come to the ground, but it's going to hit the ground more slowly than it would if there were not a tree there. And so trees are great in managing stormwater. We also have a lot of sociological and socioeconomic benefits of trees. Trees have been shown to improve our health and our well-being, can even improve test scores of children, lower cortisol levels in our bodies. So there's a lot of great benefits of trees, environmental, social, and again, trees are beautiful. And so one thing we want to emphasize in this webinar is that, have an objective in mind, know why you're planting a tree, and think about all of these benefits that trees can provide when you're doing that, not just for your own home, but for the community as well. All right, so do you run off to the tree nursery or your garden center and buy the tree first? Is that the first step in planting a new tree in your yard? We'd recommend not going that route because there's a lot to think about. And we're going to repeat this phrase throughout this webinar, but we really want to emphasize planting the right tree in the right place. And in order to do that, you really need to look at your site and think about the species that's going to match the site that you have. So you need a tree that's going to match your specific site conditions. And then you look at what type of species can meet those conditions. And I'm reading these as I go through this. Yeah, so some considerations that you want to think about when you look at your site is you want to think about how much space do you have. You want to consider what type of soil you have, how well drained that soil is, or how poorly drained it is, and then how much moisture can it hold, so how much organic matter is in the soil. You want to think about the amount of light, sunlight, and shade, and how many hours a day it gets sunlight, so that can give you an indication of a full sun, part sun, or a shady yard. And also thinking about, well, maybe you want to add on to your house at some point, so thinking about construction in the future. And also just thinking about the climate that you're in. Well, here we're in Georgia, so I believe that we're zone 8. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, and I'm thinking about the Piedmont area here, not other parts of Georgia. And so just really considering carefully what kind of environment you have around your home, and that's the first step and before you head out to the nursery and think about what tree you want to purchase. So again, we want to think about the right tree in the right place, putting the right height and dimensions of your tree, so the width and the height, matching where is it going to be located around your house, where is it located around other types of infrastructure. So some of the considerations that you have to keep in mind is that you want to think about overhead and underground utilities. Overhead utilities are a very important factor. And as we saw in that image right before this, the Arbor Day Foundation image, you only want to plant a small stature tree under power lines. If you're going to plant anything at all, it'd probably be preferable not to plant anything, because I'm going to show you some images in just a second of what happens when trees encroach on power lines. And so you really have to think about the height, the dimensions of your tree when you're considering utilities around your home. You also want to think about the sidewalks and the driveways that are in your house, or around your home, any kind of raised concrete wall or brick or stone wall. So those are the hardscapes. And so those can be limiting to tree growth, because oftentimes they're accompanied by fairly intensely compacted soil under those hardscapes, so they can be limiting. So trees have roots, as we all know, and they require soil to mine for nutrients, to provide support, to provide, to hold water and a way to uptake water. And so you want to think about having a good soil volume. So as much space as you can give a tree to grow, the better. And so we have some numbers here, 640 square feet at the minimal for a large tree. And then we kind of step down here for the medium and the small size tree. But I would really emphasize, give your tree as much soil volume and as much room to grow as possible. And that, I don't mean just the above ground, but the below ground space as well. So also you have to think about traffic, pedestrian traffic. So if you're going to want to plant a tree close to the sidewalk that's near the road at your house, you have to think about how are people going to navigate around that tree when they're walking down the sidewalk. Also thinking about vehicular traffic and not encroaching, a tree not encroaching on a road, because if trucks go by and they hit the lower limbs of that tree, it's damage to the truck, it's damage to the tree. Also, you want that tree to get to full size and become healthy and provide benefits to your yard. And if it's in conflict with, for example, vehicles, then it becomes an issue further down the road as that tree grows. Can you advance the slide? Thanks. Okay, so here's where we're looking at some conflicts with utility. And okay, so utility like Georgia Power, who service most of our electricity in this area, they have to keep the lights on, and they have to work with what trees are around power lines, whether that's a tree that was there before the power line went in or it's a tree someone planted afterwards. But they're going to do what they have to do to keep the lights on. So these trees in these images have been what are called directional. They've had directional pruning, so pruned away from the power lines. They look horrific, but that's how the power companies keep the lines safe while still, keeping trees intact somewhat. But this is, again, right tree, right place. Don't plant a full-size tree under power lines because they will be pruned like this. Next slide, please. Okay, so Seth, I may have you jump in here a little bit because I know this is your slide, and you may have a little bit more input on these soil volume measurements, but just an overall, and then I'll let Seth jump in if he wants to say something. Again, we want to have as much soil volume for root growth, which roots take up water and nutrients, provide support to the tree. We want to have as much soil volume available and square footage of that soil volume available to the tree as possible, as much as possible. And we have some different numbers here that associate with if you have a large overstory tree, a mid-story tree that could be like a mid-sized tree. We have some species listed here on this slide, or an understory tree. And it sort of steps down in the required amount of space. But I would say this is sort of a minimal requirement of space for these trees. Seth, did you want to add anything? There was something I wasn't quite sure about on your slide, so I.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, these numbers are based on just having sustainable tree growth, right? So we all see it like in parking lots. The trees look great when they plant them, and then maybe 4 or 5 years in, they start to decline, or along sidewalk planting vaults and stuff. So that's just a function of the roots getting to the edge of the allowable plantable space and soil volume, right? So, this 640 square foot number, think about, do we ever see that? This isn't an ideal world, so obviously in our yards and stuff, obviously along streets, parking lots, these numbers are super hard to get to. this 960 cubic foot number, it comes from multiplying this square foot of 640 by 18 inches by 1.5 feet, because that's where the majority of your tree roots are going to reside, in the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. In urban soils, compacted soils, maybe even like 6 to 12 inches is where most of your roots are. So that's where that cubic foot number comes from. And again, this is in an ideal world, and really this is sustainable only to about 14 or 20 inches diameter. So really, the more, the better, if you, as much as you allow it. There's open grown trees. They found roots from that tree out as far as the tree is tall. So 100-foot tree, 100-foot radius roots. So they're willing to colonize a lot more soil in this, but this is per some numbers from UGA and some other research that these are sustainable to about 14 to 20 inches diameter. So it gives us a good start. But again, more is better. These species are not all encompassing. Those are just a few that I threw on there just as examples, but you kind of get the idea. Large canopy tree, big trees, medium canopy trees, and then small. So less, you can probably get a crepe myrtle in 100 square foot and it's going to thrive, but I didn't throw that on here. Did that clear things up, Holly?
Yeah, I just wasn't sure what the per square foot of basal area was. So, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Yes. So square foot of basal area represents a, I believe 13-inch diameter tree, right? So that's where I come with that 14 to 20 number. I want to say it's 13 or 14-inch diameter tree would be a square foot of basal area. Basal area, I'm sorry, I should probably clear that up in there. That's a forest density measurement. Basically, it's a measure of cross-sectional inches of a trunk.
Thanks, Seth. I'm ready for the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about roots. So you can imagine, ideally, what does a tree need? Well, a tree needs an area for most of its roots to thrive. And if the more space you give it, as Seth was saying, the more it's probably going to grow out and extend out, because it's mining for nutrients and it's mining for water. And so this is sort of looking at kind of minimals. That's the way I like to look at it. But okay, so we have let's say this is a mature tree. We have the drip line of that tree. And generally we're going to have the root plate sort of around within that drip line. And we could say that the root plate, let's say that this tree, so the DBH, diameter at breast height, that's about 4.5 feet above the ground. Let's say that this tree is, I don't know, we'll say 24 inches in diameter. And so the root plate is probably going to be, we'll say about, because we have this based on 1 foot of diameter. Tell me if I'm saying this wrong based on the words that you used here, Seth, but 1 foot of diameter per 1 inch of diameter at breast height. So am I saying?
It's actually radius. So yeah, so your root plate's going to be 1 foot of radius out from the base of the tree for every inch of diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet off the ground. Sorry. Okay,
and so I just to make sure, so if we have a 24-inch tree, then that would mean our root plate is going to come out 12 feet. Is that the way am I saying that right, the way you have that written?
No, it would be 24-foot radius. So 24 foot and out in all directions. So the root plate's a 1-for-1. So if you have a 24-inch diameter tree, you have a 24-foot radius out from the stem of the root plate.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, I misread that. All right. So we've got our root plate out here. And then we extend out further. We see that we're much further out than the drip line of the tree, at least in this example. And our critical root zone is where the majority of the tree's roots are contained. So that's the fine roots. Those are the small little fibrous roots that take up water and nutrients. And then a lot of our structural or our larger roots. And those, let's see if I'm reading your slide right here, so we're going to be multiplying here. So we've got our 24-inch DBH tree, diameter at breast height, and it's 1.25 feet per inch radius per inch DBH. So let's see. So that's going to, oh gosh, someone's going to have to do the math for me here.
So the way I like to explain to people is, imagine we're going to make it a 10-inch diameter tree instead. So a 10-inch diameter tree, 10 times 1 is 10. So you have a 10-foot radius root plate. 10 times 1.25 gives you 12.5 feet radius of your critical root zone. And then obviously 10 times 1.5 gives you 15 feet of radius. And then you can see as the tree diameter grows, those zones are going to get bigger themselves too. They wouldn't be as close as it is in that example of a 10-inch tree.
I like your 10-inch diameter example much better than my 24-inch. I was just trying to go with what I thought it may look like, but that's much better. Yeah, so as Seth was saying, it's very possible though that the full extent of the roots from this 10-inch tree extend even beyond this critical root zone where most of the roots of the tree are clustered in here. Usually it can be about 85% of the roots here. And so we probably have additional roots out in this zone, and we see how much space that a tree's roots can take up. Can you advance the slide, Seth? And so this kind of gives a cross section of this. So we have our root plate here around the tree. This isn't quite this is a little bit different from the example we just looked at on the other slide. But as you see, and Seth was saying that roots are about 12 to 18 inches deep on average. That depends on soil type, but in our area, that's generally the case. And as you can see, they spread out much wider than they go deep. So we have a lot of really comical images of trees, cross sections where the roots go like to China. But that's really not the case. That's not what a root system looks like in reality. And so we see that the roots spread out quite far on almost all trees, if they're given the space to grow. Can you advance the slide? All right, so ideally, with keeping this in mind, we want to give the tree as much space to grow as possible. So in looking at best practices of where to place a tree, and this is just one example of tree placement, we have a car here, so this is a road, and then we have a sidewalk, person walking, and then we have this location of this tree. And I'm not going to necessarily go through all the details of this yard, but it's actually more advantageous for this tree to be planted on the other side of this sidewalk, where it can, some of its roots can grow into the yard of this home, as opposed to moving down to this lower right image, placing the tree between the road and the sidewalk, where it's got a lot of soil compaction around it. It has a much smaller rooting area. So again, just best case scenario, give the tree as much room to grow as possible, above ground and below ground.
And just for reference, if you wanted this oak tree here to have its full 640 square foot and 8-foot wide tree lawn, which is pretty rare, usually they're on the 4-foot variety, an 8-foot wide tree lawn would need to be 80 feet long to have that square foot that you really want. But then you have an asymmetrical root system. So you can see how this compromised tight window for planting just creates problems down the road. That's when you see those big trees fall over for no reason in those tree lawns.
And also damaged sidewalks and roads, and there's all sorts of conflicts that arise. Okay. All right, so okay, so we're examining our site. We're trying to see how much sunshade we have, what's the water situation, the soil, where our site is located, looking at some kind of micro and macro environmental conditions. And then we move to our next step, is thinking about the type of species that we're interested in. And we really have to match that to the conditions of our site. So we need to look at a species that matches the sun and the shade, or the sun or the shade of the site that we're looking at, and thinking about what kind of species are tolerant of that particular light requirement. We want to think about species that match our drainage or soil moisture requirements. And just thinking about, you know, some trees are going to grow okay in periodic inundated conditions, such as I'm thinking about like an overcup oak. They'll take periodic flooding. They don't want what are called wet feet or wet roots all the time. And so most trees are going to prefer well-drained soils, and some will be tolerant of wetter conditions on an occasional basis. So we also want to think about what species match our soil fertility and the pH of our site. And soil fertility and pH can be modified somewhat with fertilizer and lime or sulfur if you need to lower the pH, but it's generally good to get a soil test and kind of see what you have on your site, and then find a species that can match some of those requirements. For example, if you have really low soil fertility, and you want a tree that's going to be a little bit more tolerant to a less fertile site, then you can look at those species. And also I wanted to mention, we want to think about, maybe we like a tree that, for example, I'm thinking of sugar maple. We love sugar maples. They have beautiful fall color. You think about the Northeast and how well they grow up there. Well, sugar maple doesn't grow as well here in Georgia, and it has a host of problems. And we have some sugar maples in Winterville, in the public area of Winterville, but they don't do as well overall in comparison to for example, our red maples. And so thinking about the hardiness and the adaptability of the tree that you want, it really needs to match the conditions that you have. And then there's also something called acclimation, and it's planting a tree in your site that is acclimated sort of to the regional conditions. So for example, I'm just going to give you one example here, bald cypress. So bald cypress, as we know, can grow in slow-moving water. Sounds like someone's got an airplane going over their place. Anyway, so if you purchase a bald cypress tree from a nursery that grows it in wetter conditions, then in your site, your home landscape has a wetter site, then the tree is probably going to acclimate well to your site because it's grown from a young age in those wetter conditions. But if you have a tree you purchased from a nursery that has been grown in drier soil, and you want to put it in a wetter site in your yard, it won't acclimate as well. And so you can ask the nursery what kind of conditions they've grown the trees in that you are interested in purchasing, and making sure they're matching the conditions of your yard. Can you advance the slide? Okay, so now we're going to talk about some attributes and characteristics of trees. So this is you thinking about, okay, what function do I want this tree to serve in my yard? What kind of objectives am I looking at? So we know that one of the great benefits of trees is that they provide shade. And a lot of our ancestors were well aware of that when they're planting trees around their homes before we had air conditioning. And so shade and lower ambient temperatures are a great benefit of trees. And so that's a clear objective. But if you don't want to plant a shade tree, you want to plant a shorter stature tree, then it'll provide a little bit of shade, but it may not be the same degree as you have a full-size large shade tree. So some people plant for screen and privacy. So this could be you're trying to screen a building or a structure, or if you're just trying to provide privacy to your backyard, maybe you have a screen of evergreens like this lower right image. A lot of people also choose a particular tree species for different aesthetic qualities. So the flowers, fruit, nuts, even edible, or it could be nuts like acorns for wildlife. Foliage, so that could be you have variegated leaves. Maybe you have sort of a lime green leaf or a dark green leaf, or it could be the beauty of fall leaf color. Sometimes bark, like river birch, is very attractive, and people are drawn to having that in their yard. Branching patterns of a tree can be really something that has a aesthetic quality to it, as well as the shape of a tree. And so you can have a broad spreading canopy like an oak, or you can have something that's more columnar, I can never say that word right, columnar, like this lower right image, the Arbor Vitae tree here. So also thinking about, some people select species because they want some of those ecosystem services. They want to use those trees for stormwater uptake, or they want to use them for filtering out pollution. So just thinking about what species will achieve those goals. And also thinking about, if you have a really small space, but you want somewhat of a shade tree, then you need to match a species to that site, that space. So coming up with a species that'll get to be about the size that you have space for. And then lastly, another objective, and there's more objectives than I'm listing here on the slide, but you know, planting a tree for wildlife habitat. Next slide, please. So some other considerations in your species, tree species selection for your yard tree. And these are things that just kind of like, you know, you want to be aware of this. So again, thinking about the mature size of a tree and making sure it matches that space that you have available. So not just that you think this is, you know, beautiful fall color from a red maple, but do I have room for a red maple? Do I have the soil space? Do I have the actual, you know, above ground space? But also thinking about, you know, nuisance issues. So you love oak trees, but yeah, you really don't want to deal with the acorns. Or, you know, sweet gum has beautiful fall color, but maybe you don't want to deal with the gumballs. Or a pine is going to drop a lot of needle litter. And so just really being clear about, or pine cones, as I have in this image on the right, just being really clear about what you're willing to tolerate. And another thing I didn't put on here, but you want to also think about the maintenance of that tree. You know, is it going to need to be pruned a lot? Are there going to be a lot of leaves or needles to rake up? So just some considerations. And then also, lastly, I'm going to mention in thinking about your species selection, you need to really consider the resistance to tree problems that the tree will have. And so that can be pests or disease, and really trying to choose cultivars or species that are resilient. So ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, and they have nursery stock standards. So this is us getting to the nursery and how to choose the right tree species. So once you've decided what you want, you're selecting a particular tree at the nursery. And ANSI, not really going to go into the details of what ANSI dictates or recommends for nursery production, but basically I want you to know that there are standards out there, and really good tree nurseries follow those standards. And so they're, for the diameter of the tree, about 6 inches above the soil, they're recommending or requiring for the nurseries who practice this that the root ball of that tree be a certain diameter. And so that's something that the ANSI standards dictates, because it provides for that kind of maximum root area for nutrient and water uptake and producing a healthier tree. So go to a good tree nursery. Let's see. So you want a tree that has a good strong structure. So one central leader is ideal. You don't want that leader to be pruned normally. Fruit trees, sometimes you encounter that with, but we're not really talking about fruit trees in particular on this, thinking about shade trees, but I guess it could apply to a fruit tree. So something that doesn't have the central leader cut back, something that has a good lateral branches, the side branches kind of well spaced along that central leader. Ideally avoiding trees that have damage on the bark or wounds. That can be an entry point for insects or disease or decay if those wounds don't compartmentalize well. And then choose a containerized tree that's not root bound. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and Seth's going to talk about it more. So everyone's seen root bound, but everyone may not be familiar with the concept of, or the reality of what are called girdling roots. So when a tree is grown in the nursery, actually, Seth, I'll probably just let you talk about this a little bit later, but girdling roots in the long run of the tree can end up kind of quote unquote strangling a tree and sort of cutting off some of the water and the nutrients in the tree, because as the tree grows, it presses out against that root. And they're very damaging, and they can be removed at planting. So anyway, you want to inspect the roots of a container or even a balled and burlap tree if you're going to purchase that. And you want to, actually, can you advance the slide? I think we talk a little bit more about this. Yeah, so again, you want to find the root system. Oftentimes nurseries plant trees very deeply. That's not always the case, but if you go and you look at a tree in the nursery, you may find there's a lot of nice loose potting media covering the trunk. Dig down a little bit and keep digging down until you find those first roots that come out. It's called the root flare. And these roots can be pretty small on a small diameter tree. And I put an image here on the top right. This is kind of a full-size tree, but I wanted to show you what the root flare looks like. So it's these roots that are kind of fanning out from the base of this trunk. And you want to see that and see how much soil is still below that root flare in the container. And don't pick a tree that has too small of a root ball below that root flare. And you also, I put some nose situations here in this lower right image. You really don't want a tree that's buried too deeply in its pot. And here, these are some examples here in this middle image and the lower image. If you're digging down quite a bit, now you can ameliorate some of that at planting, but it's sort of a little bit of a red flag when you see trees with a buried root flare. And then there's recommendation, the root ball diameter should be 10 to 12 inches for every inch of trunk. So try to look for that in the nursery. Next slide. Okay, so ideally, some other things things to avoid when picking out a nursery tree. Again, we have the strong central leader in this top right image, that central trunk with these lateral branches kind of evenly spaced along the trunk. And, you know, try to avoid trees that have broken branches, any kind of cracked, diseased, or discolored bark. You can disregard that second bullet point. Yeah, just look for a good tree, look for a high quality tree, and following some of these guidelines really helps. If you get a tree that's on the discount rack, that's it's struggling, it's substandard, maybe Lowe's hasn't watered it for a week and it's wilted, it's not necessarily going to do better in your landscape. Okay, so just a little bit on site preparation. So you want to, again, soil is really important. Having a good rooting volume is really important for the tree. So compaction can be very limiting on trees. So you want to try to determine if you have a compact soil. And if your soil is compact and you don't want to ameliorate that whole area, if your planting hole is wider, that'll really help that tree spread its roots out a little bit closer to the surface. So we want to think about the drainage on your site. And one way to measure drainage is to do what's called a perk test. And this is you sort of going out, digging roughly a 12-inch deep hole, and sort of make the edges of the hole straight, so vertical. And you want to fill the hole with water, and at least 12 hours or overnight, let the water drain out. And then the next day, I'm going to give you kind of the simple, easy method. You want to fill the hole again. And if that hole has not drained in 2 to 3 hours, you have a soil that doesn't drain as well as it should. It's sort of moderately drained, and you would benefit from improving the drainage on that site by trying to break up some of the compaction and maybe digging through a deep compacted layer, either with a shovel or some equipment. That's kind of the quick and easy test, perk test. There's other ways to do that and to measure sort of per hour how much water is draining out of the site, and that can give you kind of an indication of a well-drained, moderately drained, or poorly drained. Do a soil test, figure out what the pH and the soil nutrient availability are on the site. And if you're going to be planting any large trees, or actually it could probably be any tree, definitely call 811 and figure out where your utilities are, so you're safely digging around those utility lines if they're buried. And I think that's you now, Seth. I'm sorry if I went over my time.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Yeah, I'll take over. Thanks, Holly. That was good stuff. You know, I really liked that extra point you made about thinking about maintenance level on a tree, because things like your maples and stuff are going to need more, you know, tighter pruning cycles than things like your oaks and stuff like that. You know, crepe myrtle is in the beginning, a pretty labor intensive tree to get it grown up right and not just top it all the time. But that's a whole nother PowerPoint about that. Yeah, so we'll try to run through. Now we're going to kind of talk about, you know, we picked out our site, we picked out our species, either one or the other first. It's kind of a chicken and egg situation like Holly was talking about. It really depends on each situation. So we have the perfect tree for the perfect spot. We have done some site prep. We've got 811 called, all that stuff. Now let's talk about actually getting the tree in the ground and getting it established. So, you know, I always like to start talking about those things with like unloading and handling. You know, it doesn't seem like it would be a big deal, but leaving a tree like in the back of the bed of the pickup and driving home from Lowe's or, you know, Kofer's or wherever, you're pretty likely, especially when you have leaf on, to get things like wind burn on your trees. So basically you can look at it when the tree's going, if you're going 45 miles an hour, that's like constant 45-mile-an-hour winds on those little young leaves. And the tree's response to that, to keep from the tissue from drying out, is to just start sucking all the water it has in its root ball out. So if it runs out of water in that process, then you end up getting some wind burn, some leaf scorch, things like that. Another thing to really keep in mind when you're getting trees is, you know, never pick them up by the stem. I see it happen all the time. It seems like a nice, perfect little handle to grab the tree by, but never lift it by the stem or the trunk. Always pick it up by the container, by the root ball, things like that. Now, I know a lot of homeowners won't be planting bald and burlap trees. We'll talk a little bit about it, but, you know, you got to have equipment, but make sure when you see people unloading those to plant them at your house or something, make sure they don't have the straps on the trunk. Make sure it's lifted by the root ball, because if you pull on the trunk, you kind of pull that root plate a little bit, and if it breaks, you know, real good surface tension with the dirt clod, with the root ball and the dirt underneath it, then you lose a lot of that surface tension and adhesion that root plate has to that soil. So again, super important there. If you are going to be unloading heavier trees, like maybe 30-gallon, 40-gallon trees in containers or bald and burlap, you know, having somebody that really knows what they're doing on the equipment, whether it be a tractor, a backhoe, something like that, skid steer. I've seen many a trees get bashed by someone just getting their fingers flubbled and moving the arm of the thing to the right and bashing the trunk, and it's just no good for the tree. The trees can't really seal trunk wounds. So experienced operator, somebody that really knows what they're doing, it's really important there. And if you're going to get your trees, like if you're going to go maybe buy them in November, not plant till December, January, something like that, you know, make sure, and this really pertains more to bald and burlap as well, make sure they're sitting upright and up straight. Sometimes I'll see people store trees and they'll just lay them all over on the side and cover the whole pile of root balls with mulch. That kind of messes the tree up a little bit, because it's always trying to grow up towards the light and towards the sun. So that kind of messes with the sugar flow and the hormonal balance and all that stuff. Some growth hormones go where they're not supposed to, and growth regulators go where they're not supposed to. So make sure you leave it sitting, you know, straight up. And, you know, just protect your terminal buds. When you're in transport, that terminal bud on the very end, the very tallest point, that's where all of your growth regulators house. That's going to keep that tree growing vertically and not make a lot of lateral latent buds activate and grow, get a lot of wonky sideways growth. So really protect those terminal buds, wrap it in a tarp and a blanket, something like that. You know, there's no science, no, it's not rocket science, just, you know, common sense. Just keep the wind off of it and keep that bud protected during transport. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about planting bald and burlap trees, just because, you know, again, I don't think many homeowners are gonna be planting them, but you might have contractors come in and plant them for you. So I always like to share these things that way you can kind of watch, do some quality control, and if you don't see some of these practices happening, or all of them, then maybe have a talk with your contractor, and definitely make note of it and document it, because if your trees fail and they planted them incorrectly, then you know, you might have some ground to stand on for replacement. The big thing with bald and burlap trees, and, you know, planting any tree, is making sure this root flare is up high. The number one mistake I see made, or any tree being planted too deep. So make sure you can see this root flare, and see right there, that buttress at the bottom. You want that to be up above the ground. With a heavier bald and burlap tree, I plant them about an inch or two shallow, even higher than the ground level, because it'll settle under the weight of that tree next time it rains. So just make sure you got it nice up and shallow above soil grade. You know, make sure you remove all the trunk wraps and tags. You'll find little ID tags tied up in here and stuff. And I know it doesn't seem like much, but a little bread tie can girdle a small stem over time. You know, if you're going to stake a tree, and I'll talk a little bit more about staking, make sure that they're nice and loose, that they're not tight. And I'll explain that here in a minute. You know, make sure you have good mulch material. We'll talk much specifically about mulch in a second as well. The big thing that is unique to balled and burlap is they come, you know, they're going to weigh, depending on the size of the tree, a 2-inch caliper tree, probably 300 to 500 pounds, somewhere in there. Your 5-inch caliper trees can weigh over 1,000 pounds. So, you know, they can be big things, but what's unique about them is they come in that metal basket wrapped around a burlap sack, essentially, right? And so there's people on both sides of the fence. Some people say take all the basket and wire off. Some people don't take any of it off. And I'm kind of right in the middle, and I follow the ISA best management practices. They say remove the top 2/3. So I pretty much get down as easy, you know, I'll dig the hole, get my tree set in there fully dressed. I don't unwrap it at all. I roll it into the hole, get it where I want it, and then dress down that top 2/3 and get all that wire snipped out of there, burlap cut off. That just allows, you know, that top 12 to 18 inches of roots to get really, you know, branch out into the soil. That burlap also, you know, it can provide a root barrier before it rots away. I pulled enough dead trees up out of the ground using the old wire basket attached to a winch to know that it can't be good for the trees. So if you don't see your contractors with a pile of refuse of wire and burlap beside each planting hole, you might want to have a talk with them and see what's up there. One other thing, and this goes with planting any tree, always make sure to backfill with the native soil you pulled out of the hole. You don't necessarily want to backfill with just topsoil or potting soil. If you have those really drastically different soil textures, you're going to get water hold up in, you know, the clay and dry out faster in the loam, and you'll just have root congregation and just issues there. So to keep the hydrology nice and uniform on the site and keep our water flow the way it was before we messed with anything, just backfill with your native soil. And you notice this number right here, and this can be a hard number to hit when you're talking about planting a 48-inch diameter root ball, 3 times as wide as the root ball. But that really is essential to break up that compaction and make a good rooting environment for those young roots. And I might have just said a lot of these things on the last slide, but you know, again, you see this number 10 times. So ideally, you take a rototiller and till out a big giant circle and then dig your planting hole inside of that. That's really just going to make the best just fluffy soil available with lots of macro pore space and water infiltration, and just make the best environment for those new roots to grow into. Again, you know, the biggest mistake I see is people planting trees too deep, especially balled and burlap, because they settle so much because they're so heavy. So make sure, you know, contractors or yourself are planting B&B trees nice and shallow. You know, and one other thing I didn't mention here, you'll notice the sides of this hole, I actually make them more about, you know, 30 degrees, maybe 45, excuse me. I like them to be nice and slanted. The reason for that being is if you just have like a square shaped hole, those roots are going to grow into that, and they might just turn one way or the other when they meet that flat wall. When they meet that sloped wall, it kind of encourages them to push out radially out into the landscape. So you want to have the edge of the hole nice and slanted, kind of like a bathtub, and then take your shovel or rake and scarify that up so you don't have any clay films, just so you make sure water can move laterally and down through that soil. So more for, you know, tonight's audience and for homeowners, you know, planting container trees is what you're going to be doing more often than not. So this, you know, obviously you can find 3-gallon container trees. You can find 100-gallon container trees. You know, we probably, you know, I usually recommend homeowners, if you have the ability to transport it, a 15-gallon tree is a nice substantial root ball, provides some weight, so maybe you can avoid staking. But also those 3 and 5-gallon trees are really cost effective. They just have really small, limited root systems, so require a little bit more, you know, care and vigilance. The big problem you're going to find with, you know, with your containerized trees is going to be girdling and circling roots. So it's just inherent in the nursery industry. They start them off in like a 1-gallon pot, and then they size it up to 3, and then up to 5, and up, you know, on up the scale. And if they do that on a nice, you know, perfect timing schedule, then you don't get your circling roots. But when you have a nursery with thousands of trees, sometimes some of them get away from you. So you'll pull them out of the container and you'll find this situation right here. And that's not even really that bad. I usually, any container tree I plant, I take it out of the pot, take my saw, and just kind of butterfly it like a steak. People are always amazed how rough I am with the root balls on them, but it's better to go ahead and get rid of those circling roots, stimulate a lot of new fine feeder root growth, because once those roots get in that circling pattern, they're not going to stop. And I've got a slide about girdling roots coming up that shows what this looks like in, you know, 2 to 4 years if you don't do anything about it. But yeah, so all the same principles as this really, you know, as this big diagram about planting B&B. The only difference is that scarifying the root ball, getting rid of your J roots and your circling roots and things like that. And this is just another diagram, just kind of showing that it really is important to try to get as much soil spaced out around that tree as possible. You don't want to dig the hole, obviously, just big enough to cram that root ball down into. Unfortunately, it happens a whole lot, and that's when you get circling roots, the girdling roots. You don't get good root expansion, and the tree just kind of struggles. But again, that 3 times the width of the root ball, ideally, is if you're doing things to BMPs, that's what you want to see. And again, these are just the big things I see. So many trees planted too deep. We all see them. They look like a telephone pole coming straight out of the ground. It's a huge, it's the obvious sign they were planted too deep. Trees that are planted too deep are going to struggle their whole life. A lot of your gas exchange with your root system happens at that root collar and that root flare. And so if that's buried, basically your tree's just kind of gasping for air its whole life. Because, we all learned from when we were little, trees breathe CO2 in their leaves and give off oxygen. But the roots practice chemical respiration just like we do. So they need, oxygen as part of that process. So they breathe oxygen and give off CO2 just like an animal would. So, a lot of your gas exchange is going to happen there. And if you have that buried, the tree's just going to be kind of struggling. It's going to lose its leaves early. It's going to leaf out late. It's just not going to grow as vigorous as it should. And another thing, just not prepping the area wide enough is a really big mistake. I see a lot of times too, especially in our urban environments. Even a lightly compacted soil in an urban environment is compared to forest soil is super compacted. Because remember, when we're planting trees, what we're trying to do is take something that doesn't naturally want to grow in an urban soil and make it grow there. So we have to try to recreate those natural growing conditions as best as possible. And one of the number one things we can do to do that, to mimic the forest, is having nice aerated organic matter soils with organic material covering, i.e. mulch. So there's one other type of stock that you might run into planting if you get your seedlings from the Georgia Forestry Commission or Arbor Day Foundation. Sometimes they'll send bare root, things like that. So bare roots are going to be your tiny little whips more often than not. You can get larger stock in bare root. It sometimes can be a problem because there's so little weight on the bottom. They do require a lot of staking for longer than you would like. But yeah, for your smaller trees, same principles as planting the other trees. Just the difference would be is you dig out your hole and then you put some dirt back in and build that little cone and set your base of your root plate on that and kind of feather out those little feeder roots out onto that mound. And that's going to encourage them to start growing out away. You don't want to just open up a hole in the ground and cram it down in there. You're going to get J roots and all that stuff. So same principle as other plantings, just with that little mound and feathering those roots out. It takes a little more delicate touch. These are great for like kid planting projects, reforestation projects, really cost effective and easy to handle and plant. The big problems are they have such a limited root system. You got to really stay on top of watering. And we'll talk about watering in a second, but you have to really stay on top, a lot more frequent, small applications of water to that limited root system. They get ran over by lawnmowers, kids pull them up, animals dig them. So there are a lot of urban stressors that fight against being able to do a lot of bare root seedling planting. But it has been proven through studies to be one of the most cost-effective ways to increase community tree canopy is large-scale seedling planting. So a lot of times it's done as underplanting under established trees. A big thing, you're going to have weed control issues. So, if you're doing bare root plantings, just, be real careful. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend Roundup around a tree that small. As trees get bigger, if it's done right and carefully, you can use glyphosate under a tree. But when they're that young, I would stay away from it. So a lot of hand weeding. So a good mulch ring is going to prevent you from having to do a lot of that. So again, that was where the bang, 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 the 3 types of planting stock. And I'm happy to share these slides with whomever, and these diagrams. A lot of these diagrams are on our resources on our website as well. So we've got our tree planted in the ground. So now we're going to move on to watering. So, watering begins the minute you put that tree in the ground, because the minute you've taken it out of that pot and put it in new soil, it hits transplant shock right that second. And transplant shock is going to just drive a whole bunch of physiological processes, and just basically the tree is going to be using more water than it normally would when just sitting in its pot, because it's kind of freaking out. So, you want to go ahead and water really good at planting. A good rule of thumb to follow when you're watering a newly planted tree is about 5 to 7 gallons per caliper inch. So if you're planted a 2-inch caliper tree, you would once a week apply about 14 gallons of water. Now I say once a week because you don't want to water your trees every single day. You don't want to have drip irrigation going on them every day or even every other day. Really, once a week in normal summer weather. And when I say, summer, I consider watering time really to be pretty much April through October is when I like to water newly planted trees. Once they get in the dormant season, we get enough rain, everything's good there. But yeah, so, once a week with your 5 to 7 gallons per caliper inch, maybe twice a week if you're, if we just get 98 degrees days, day after day, and you're maybe got a little more sandy or looser soil, maybe get more runoff or anything like that. So if you're getting good infiltration and we're not in just terrible heat wave, once a week with your 5 to 7 gallons is pretty good. Now, if you're getting about 2 to 3 inches of rain a week or more, that should be sufficient to at least, get the tree through to the next supplemental watering. But yeah, if you do the math on the root zone of a newly planted tree, 2 inches of rain adds up to only be about the gallons we need. So 2 inches seems like a lot, but for that small surface area, it's really not. So it's important just to stay on top of watering. This is the number one reason I see young trees fail is just lack of water in that first year after planting. And again, just notice, you don't want to keep that soil saturated. Trees really like to get all the way soaked through and saturated, then all the way dried out, then all the way saturated, then all the way dried out. They don't like to stay wet all the time. If they do, you get root rot issues. It encourages more surface level roots because the trees aren't having to dig as much for the water. It just leads to a lot of problems. Basically, you're just kind of babying the tree, and you really need the tree to learn, like, you're only getting water once a week, maybe. So, it's got to learn to survive. Now, when you're planting new trees, there's a lot of different ways to water your newly planted trees. There's a lot of commercial products out there, these tree gators, gator bags, ooze tubes, kind of a newer one. This is a tree diaper down here. So this is filled with like hydrogel. The rain actually kind of recharges and then it slowly leaches out. All of them have their benefits. All of them also have their drawbacks. Both of these products draw fire ants really badly. These products draw black widows sometimes. They just think, like the water box in front of your house. So just be mindful when you're messing with these things. Wear gloves and just be mindful of it. But they do really help if you have a tree maybe way out far away from your house or from a water hose or anything like that. The way I really prefer to water newly planted trees is I take a couple 5-gallon buckets, I've tapped a nail hole in the bottom, and I just set those on both sides of the tree, let it slowly leach out, and maybe go out in 30 minutes, refill them, rotate them, let it slowly leach out. And then we've done a pretty good job of watering our critical root zone all, 360 degrees with a nice slow leach. It's not going to run off and all that good stuff. So like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can use your hose, just try to consider measuring your hose flow rate, fill up a 5-gallon bucket and time it, something like that. Again, you're going to really flood them that first, watering or two, maybe go above that 7 gallons. But then after that, you don't want to be flooding them all the time. So we've got our tree in the ground. We have watered it in. It's didn't settle on us, luckily, if we're looking at our hypothetical tree. And if it did settle at planting, sometimes that'll happen when you do that flooding watering. The point of that flood, right when you plant it, is to flush out a lot of air pockets. You want to get rid of any air pockets. If a root grows into a big, dry, empty pocket, it's going to desiccate and die. So that really ensures that you have surface tension between roots and soil and surface contact throughout that root zone. But sometimes when you do that flooding process, you'll get a little settling and maybe the tree leans a little bit. So that's your opportunity just to right the thing up, make sure it's, good and straight up. 1 or 2 degree lean isn't going to be the end of the world. Trees will straighten that. They'll right themselves over time as they reach for the sun. But you definitely don't want to have anything more than like 4 or 5 degree lean, just because it might end up having kind of just a crooked stem as it gets older. But it's best for if it's perfectly straight. So we've watered it in, it settled a little bit, we reset it. Now we're going to apply our mulch. Again, we're recreating those natural growing conditions. If you go out in the woods and look on the ground, what do you see? But you see mulch all over the ground. So again, we're recreating those natural growing conditions. Mulch has a ton of awesome benefits. It retains soil moisture, helping you not have to irrigate as much, suppresses weeds, keeps weed eaters and Roundup away from my young trees, which is great. It helps alleviate soil temperatures, keeps them cooler in the summer, warm in the winter. Over time, provides organic input and carbon back into the soil, which will improve the soil structure and, fertility and health. It also can help, over time, reduce soil compaction. It can also keep you from getting soil compaction. So if you're going to have, maybe your kiddos running around your newly planted tree, a good mulch bed is going to keep their little feet from compressing the soil. So, mulch, I usually like to revisit a mulch ring twice a year, as, in the spring and the fall. You just want to make sure, because as it decomposes, it kind of forms what we call a thatch layer. It's a little watertight, doesn't let some water move through it necessarily. So you just want to stir that up with a rake real good, and then maybe put some fresh top dress on there as it, as some's broken down. Really any organic material, pine straw, wood chips, maybe more solid compost, like, with more wood material in it. Even the tree's own leaves. I mean, that's nature's mulch, right? I prefer hardwood chips. I feel like they stand up better, provide a little more protection. So again, make sure you're removing it, breaking it up. Your goal is to always have kind of a layer of 2 to 3 inches of mulch around the, critical root zone, or at least the drip line of the tree. That's usually kind of the delineation. People go out to the furthest out branches and mulch to there. Ideally, the further out you can mulch, the better. My front yard is all mulch now. I kept expanding the mulching. Now it's all mulch, and I don't have to mow. It's wonderful. One thing, keep the mulch away from the trunk. You don't want it mounded up on there. This being why, you don't want to see the mulch all mounded up. We call this volcano mulching. This is can be a pretty big deal. What it does to the tree thinks it's buried about 2 feet deep. So what's it going to do is spit out new little roots right here. Those little roots aren't going to have much strength. They're just going to kind of wrap around the tree. So you'll end up with girdling roots all down through this 18 or 24 inches of volcano mulch. It's just not good for the tree. It just kind of chokes it out. I don't even think it looks nice. So anyway, no volcano mulch. No, yes, that's what we're looking for. A nice uniform thickness, flat disc. You notice that little space right there. That's just going to allow for that oxygen exchange and breathing from the root flare. And like I said, just a nice, uniform disc out at least to the drip line, but really as far as you're willing to get out there and wheelbarrow mulch around. So just real quick about staking and strapping. I don't like to stake trees unless I absolutely have to. Reason being, trees, as they sway in the winds, they build that forms what they call reaction wood. So it's compression when it leans over and tension on the side it's pulling from. I kind of liken it to when we work out and we tear our muscle fibers and they grow back stronger than before. It's kind of the same thing. So that reaction wood is actually stronger than the original wood. So the trees, that's their mechanism to learn to stand up against gravity and against wind. But if they're strapped for too long, or maybe, too tightly, and there's no play, that's why I mentioned you want to have it nice and loose, because it still needs to be able to sway in the wind. If you have them too tight or on there for too long, when you take those straps off, the tree is going to be real susceptible to just leaning over, because it's never had to stand up on its own, and it's built no reaction wood, hasn't reached its roots out further. So the tree is always constantly responding. Every day its growth is directly responding to the forces of gravity and wind shear. So if we take those, stressors away, the tree never learns to stand up against gravity and wind. These are also things that come away from strapping. That's why I'm always scared. A lot of trees I plant in communities, I'm worried I'll never actually put my hands on them again. So I always get nervous about leaving the straps on there, because we end up with something like this. Another major thing you can avoid, or have your contractors avoid, is weed eater damage, lawnmower damage on the base of the trees. Trees have no ability to seal those wounds or compartmentalize wounds along their trunk like that. So once that damage is done, it's probably done. Eventually you're going to have some, fungal decay there and maybe have a weak spot in the stem. So other avoidable problems, root damage, and that can be either soil disturbance or soil compaction. Both very detrimental to the health of the tree. You can, make sure that you don't do bad pruning. So whenever you do a pruning cut, you have to realize you are not only taking sugar production ability away from the tree, but you're also reallocating resources that were going to that branch. Those resources from the roots are going somewhere else. So just realize that every pruning cut you make, it has an effect on the overall health and structure and long-term viability of that tree. So if you do topping cuts and stuff like that, then you're reallocating resources to lateral growth. And trees want to grow up. That's their whole goal, is to beat each other to the sun, right? So just think about, you don't want to go through all this work, plant this tree perfectly, and then do bad pruning cuts and then be told by an arborist, oh, that tree's form's never going to be right. Let's plant another one. So, and also watch it with the fertilizers and stuff. I don't fertilize at planting. Typically the trees come with so much residual fertilizer from the nursery. There's going to be no soil fertility issues within that root ball. Now, once they start to branch out into the area around that root, so maybe that next year because then maybe consider fertilization. A healthy tree's roots on average are going to grow about, 18 inches, 12 to 18 inches radially each year. So you can assume that after you planted for a year or two after planting, then maybe it's time to do a little bit of slow release fertilizer in that newly colonized root zone area. But be careful with it because too much nitrogen at planting will force a lot of weird growth and make the tree exhaust all of its resources. And, that's where that term burning the roots comes from. And basically the tree can't keep up with how much growth it's putting on the top. So, again, I mentioned this, we can always make sure that ourselves or our contractors are following this best management practice. Again, this is in the ANSI standards for tree planting, so they should know it. And if they act like they don't, maybe you want to ask about their credentials. And again, Holly mentioned that, just making sure when you do get at something, especially if it's balled and burlap, inherently that machine that digs them is going to push soil up the stem a little bit. So as you undress them, sometimes you have to, kind of shave off some of that soil that's been pushed up around there. But as long as it's not like compacted on there and that's the way it's grown, you should be good. So this is just a little pitch about, like I said, I take my saw and I would still plant this tree, but I would take my saw and cut about 5 or 6, downward angles on this and then go underneath and kind of do an X and butterfly it. Again, you're giving it a puncher's chance. You might sever a lot of roots, which seem counterintuitive at planting. But if you plant this thing in the ground as is, it, down the road, it's just going to be a mess and it's never really going to thrive. So young trees with their fine roots can take that kind of damage. So this is your chance to undo that and try your best. I mean, if you can feather these out without cutting, great. But a lot of times it's a rat's nest and you just have to cut it. If you don't, this is what you can end up with in just a relatively short time, 2 to 4 years in the ground. And that tree starts to decline, maybe falls over in a light wind. And then when they pull it out of the ground, they realize not only were they able to pull it out of the ground, but this is what they found. So this tree was not only nothing was done to its root ball, but it was also planted too deep, you can tell. So this tree just had it against it from the get-go. So, again, trees, the hardest part is really for a young tree after you get it planted. It's a lot of fun to plant it. Everybody wants to get involved with planting and get out there and help. But then who's going to actually get out there once a week and water this thing and do its pruning after the first year and call an arborist when it gets, gets maybe a defoliating insect when they think their young tree might be dying, something like that. Who's gonna be in charge of it for the long term? So survival really hinges on that 2 years of just coaching. Pardon the sports puns. I used this slide last at the Sports Hall of Fame. So I had these sports puns in here. But yeah, for real. So and when I plant a tree, I usually consider the establishment period being equal to the number of caliper inches. So if you have a 2-inch caliper tree, you're going to need to baby that thing for at least 2 growing seasons before it has enough, root area that it can kind of take care of itself. And when I say babying, I mean that once a week watering. So if you can see, if you plant a 4-inch caliper tree, you really got to stay on top of that for 3 or 4 years before you can really just let it go on its own. But again, survival really hinges on someone being a long-term champion of that tree. Again, planting with a purpose. We realize that we plant a tree today, we're not going to see the full benefits of that for a long time, but there's a lot of work involved to get it to that point, right? But a wise man is the one that plants a tree that he will not sit under the shade, right? So, and again, just being observant, just taking notes of things you see. Young trees are really reactive in a good way, but they're also very susceptible and can be very reactive in a bad way to pretty small stressors. So the smaller a tree, a lot of times something can take it out a lot faster. So just be diligent, be observant. And so kind of just my main takeaways here, we're taking an organism that wants to grow in the forest and planting it not in the forest, right? So it's our job as tree advocates, as arborists, as just, tree huggers, I could dare say, just to make sure that we are doing our best to recreate those natural growing conditions, right? So you think about trees in the woods, they're nice and shallow. There is adequate soil moisture, but never soil inundation. There is natural mulch over it. Also, the forest has time on us, right? There's no soil disturbance. There's no development. So a tree growing from an acorn has all the time in the world to become a big giant oak. So again, it's up to us to just try to recreate those natural growing conditions. You know, there's so many urban stressors that go against trees. The odds are really stacked against them. I'll throw a really sad statistic out after my awesome call to action. The average life of a street tree in the state of Georgia is estimated to be 7 years old. So 7 years for an organism that can live 200 to 500 years means that somewhere there's a disconnect. We're not doing something right. And I'm talking about street trees, parking lot trees, things along the right of way and things, but still proves that there's a disconnect somewhere and we are not getting the full picture of how to care for these trees and let them live long, sustainable lives. So there's just so many urban stressors. It's up to us, again, just to watch out for those, be advocates for people to not exasperate those stressors, and do what we can to keep on living amongst a community forest. So I think that was all I had. I love this diagram because this is a great, just, you know, small example of all the things that are against a tree. There's some septic systems like utility lines, cars hitting them, narrow sidewalk vault, animals using the bathroom, kids pulling branches, bad pruning, power lines overhead. I mean, you see all the things stacked against them. But they are the ultimate opportunists. So if we give them a chance, a puncher's chance, they'll get out there and do it. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Seth. That was great.
Yeah. And I know we might not have any questions tonight, but you know, there's my email address, and if anybody wants to reach out with questions, I'm also happy to share these slides. And then our website down here has tons of awesome resources on a wide variety of tree care topics. Most of these diagrams came from a lot of those resources. So.
And also, if anyone is interested in learning more about the Winterville Tree Commission, you can go to the Winterville City website and look under government, and we're one of the commissions that's listed there. And you can email us at wintervilletreecom@gmail.com. And we would love to have your questions, or if anyone's interested about the community forestry and arboriculture degree program at UGA, I would love to entertain any questions that you may have. My email address is on the slide.
Yeah, please help share the word about the COFA program, because I know from being in the community forestry industry, we would love to have more young people coming out with formal education in community forestry. So please help spread the word. Anybody you know that's young and looking for a career and loves trees, tell them we got a great one for them.
So I actually have a question.
Yeah.
I'm Brian's wife. So that was really interesting. I'm curious about the amount of material above ground versus in the root zone, because I work in grasslands where it's sort of equal or even more is below ground than above. And so I was very surprised just to see sort of how shallow those roots are. I know that they're fine and they spread extensively. So I guess the other part of my question is, are there some trees that have tap roots and things that do go a lot deeper than what you've been talking about?
Yeah, Holly, do you want to go or?
Yeah, well, they're trees. The soil can factor in on tree depth, and so there are some trees, I'm thinking about the tropics here, that can actually put some pretty deep roots down in the soil and mining the soil. And really it's about mining the soil, and it's also about oxygen level in the soil. So grassland soils are very different from the soils, the kind of less fertile clay-rich soils that we have here in the Piedmont, I mean, even in the upper coastal plains and the mountains. And so our soils are just a little bit different because we don't have the same amount of organic matter and structure as grassland soils that could allow more oxygen to reach a little bit deeper, and there'd be more nutrients, moisture holding capacity at a deeper level that grass roots could reach to at those depths. Because I know what you're talking about. Grasslands have some of the richest soils in the world, which is why we farm them, even though they may not have a lot of water or precipitation. But tree roots, I think it has a lot to do with where where the tree is growing, but I guess I'm thinking specifically in our area. There's going to be more oxygen closer to the soil surface, and there's also going to be more nutrients in our soils because, again, our soils aren't incredibly fertile. Even, well, that could be argued. They're not as fertile now that a lot of 150 years of farming washed away most of the topsoil here. So maybe at some point they did go deeper, but at this stage they're fairly shallow rooted in this region.
So then the biomass that's below ground is way less than is above ground.
Sorry, you can answer that too, but in our area, yes, it is far less. It kind of depends on where you are, but there's some coastal plain soils that will have organic matter at a deeper level in the soil, but the oxygen and the water table is really high. So yeah, okay. So the roots, yeah, anyway, but you go ahead, Seth. I'm sure you have more to add too.
I was just going to throw in, there's a concept called root to shoot ratio. And so, the tree's kind of always kind of in a back and forth a little bit. So it's kind of as root mass expands, okay, well, there's more sugar production, more uptake happening of water and nutrients. So there's more leaf production. So then there's more sugar production, which in turn fuels more carbohydrate storage, which fuels more root growth. So it kind of becomes a cyclical thing. But yes, I think the overall biomass of a tree is predominantly above ground, especially in our soils, like Holly was saying. Your second question about species with taproots. So, taproots are more of a juvenile tree structure. Sometimes like pines in South Georgia, where you have 20-foot deep sand, sometimes they'll still have a taproot existent. When they blow over, they'll see it snapped. It's more of a juvenile structure as the tree's kind of establishing where it's at, looking for basically the point at which roots cannot grow anymore due to, low oxygen content. So it's kind of just an exploratory thing that goes down there. Once the tree gets established, starts growing out radially, it usually aborts that taproot and it just kind of decays underneath the tree.
I like one of our colleagues describes a taproot kind of like Seth was just saying, is like it's kind of checking out its environment, like it's exploring around, it's gathering information about where it's growing. And it's like, okay, how much oxygen's down here at depth? How much compaction am I experiencing? And it's like it's collecting data for the tree to know where to put roots down.
Thank you. That answers it. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna go read more about root to shoot ratio now. I feel like that was an inadequate answer.
Well, and grasses are such a different type of plant compared to a tree. Grass is a monocot, trees are dicots, and granted we have palm trees are monocots as well, and it's just a different type of plant. And so it's interesting to make the comparison though, but trees do have a lot of biomass underground. Like the surface area of the fine roots is just tremendous, because 90% of a tree's roots are what are called fine roots, and it's like a fibrous mat of roots, and those are most of the tree's roots, but most of like what's taking up the water and the nutrients. And also they're the ones who make these symbiotic relationships with mycorrhiza, which help the tree take up even more water and nutrients. And there's a lot of mass there. Like there's just a lot of surface area. And so a tremendous amount of biomass is under the soil surface. It's just not as deep here as you would see like with grass, which goes remarkably deep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, a number that just popped to my head, might want to double check me on this. Typically trees in soils like ours are looking at a 1 to 5 root to shoot ratio. So wow. It's actually considerably more above ground. That number came to me just now. So.
Would you guys have any other questions?
I don't think so. Seth, what was that watering method you mentioned that you do? You put a nail hole in a bucket, is that right?
Yeah, it's real fancy. I have a couple I call my watering buckets at the office. I just tap one nail hole in the bottom of it. You could do one on each side if you want a little quicker drain. But that's what I'll usually use to water in new trees, just because I know it's going to provide a nice slow leach into the soil, and
Yeah, I really
helps me
like that.
also
Plus, you know
helps
how
me
much.
follow the volume too. So.
Yeah, right, right. That's cool.